Good morning. I'm Doug Lyle. I'm a psychologist. My dad says that this means that anything I have to say couldn't possibly be very important. Mostly, he's probably right. But not this morning. This morning, I've been asked to introduce T. Colin Campbell. Did you ever go to a dinner party and the subject of diet and health comes up? What do? I have this battle inside. Am I going to let it go? Or am I going to pull a McDougal? Now, Dr. John McDougall thinks that McDougling is when you eat a health-promoting vegetarian diet. And this is true, I'll concede that. But pulling a McDougal is something completely different. This is a sudden, inexplicable, irresistible, pathological urge to tell the truth, no matter what the consequences. Now, don't be too proud of it. It's a disease. Of course, when I do this at a dinner party, the open-minded, curious, thoughtful carnivores present are always so appreciative when I share my knowledge. You know how they are. The love flows. I don't know what happens to you, but when the disease strikes in me, fortunately rarely, I'll go home, I'll look myself in the mirror, and I'll ask, well, you studly, handsome genius, what on earth were you thinking? Telling the truth in the face of serious consequences is heroic. Heroic, but not recommended. It's a personality flaw, and there's no percentage in it. But there are those who won't play the percentages, like T. Colin Campbell. Growing up on the family dairy farm, young Colin Campbell thought that milk and cheese was great. He went to school, became a nutritional biochemist, bent upon finding a better way to feed the world high-quality animal protein to help save the world. He was so outstanding that he rose relentlessly through the academic ranks to become, among other things, the senior science advisor to the American Institute for Cancer Research, an endowed professor at Cornell University, the #1 research institution in nutritional biochemistry in America. And finally, the principal investigator of the China study, the most sophisticated epidemiological study of diet and disease ever conducted. But there's been a problem. Professor Campbell learned that milk and cheese weren't so good after all. When he and his colleagues discovered this, it became clear that this was a discovery of incalculable importance. It could help save the world, but very, very inconveniently for the powers that be. Telling these truths has led him not to problems at a dinner party, but to cross swords with powerful industries. It has meant facing down congressional level pressure and dealing with university and government agents suggesting what the great professor should study and what conclusions he should reach. But to the frustration of all these fine, psychologically well-adjusted folks, Colin Campbell could not manage to keep himself quiet, no matter what the consequences. He not only discovers the truth, but he will tell it. Today we get the chance to have him tell us something of his work. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege to introduce my colleague, mentor, friend, and hero, Dr. T. Colin Campbell.
Thank you, Doug. Nice words. I've enjoyed a few times being in the audience and listened to Dr. Lyle give his lectures. Really enjoyed it, but this is the first time I've had to follow his remarks. Doug, you should come back up here again and keep this up. I'm not a psychologist, though, by the way. I do have a lot to say, but before doing that, let me first thank Jeff and Sabrina Nelson for the invitation, putting this program together, and I do hope, in fact, that they'll continue this for years to come, because I think they're really on to something. I know they're on to something. I've got a lot to talk about in a fairly short period of time, and as I was thinking about putting these thoughts together and some slides and things like this, I really had a hard time selecting what to put in it to try to cover this sort of, this ocean of information, in a sense, that to me is so convincing. It is really so convincing, and my convincing, or my sort of enthusiasm for this work has really come about because of the evidence in the research world that I've been involved with for now, 40 to almost 50 years, I guess, 40-some years. So I'm just going to sort of touch the tops of some waves and tell you why I think this is so important. It unfolds, though. My comments really unfold, in a sense, with my own sort of research career, if you will. I hope you forgive me for that. But I did, in fact, with my colleagues, my many, many students, fellow professors in some cases, not all, obviously, did, in fact, go through this and sort of asking the obvious questions and then going to the next questions and so forth and so on, to finally come to this point where I guess I have to say I'm a vegetarian or a vegan. And that's not where I started out to be, as Doug has pointed out. But the evidence is really so powerful, and I'm sure that many of you appreciate that, and the distinguished group of speakers that you will be hearing here, I think you'll enjoy. They have been pioneers in this field. And so I'm just going to kind of fill in some cracks insofar as the research is concerned. So if I can have their first slide. So I'm going to start out with the problem. Wait, we're going backwards. I don't have it on my screen up here, by the way. I did. I don't now. I don't know why we're getting here so far back. Okay, let's start with the problem. You know the problem. I just decided to put down a few thoughts here that, just to tell you, the problem is really big. Adults overweight, 65%. A third of us are obese. The youth are especially vulnerable. During any given week, according to some surveys, half of us take at least one prescription drug in this country, and 4 out of 5 of us take some kind of medication. But yet, the drug reactions, the adverse drug reactions and other medication errors make it the number 3 cause of death in this country. 225,000 people a year. How many times have you seen that? Heart disease, number 1, cancer, number 2, and going to the doctor, number 3? That's a pretty tough message. Yet at the same time, the cost of medical care in this country is the highest it is in the world. Germany's second, it's only 60% of us. So we're paying a lot in many ways. And so in the final analysis, we now know that most of these disease-related deaths, really quite frankly, are preventable by diet. So if we can solve this problem or help to solve this problem through dietary approaches, there's 2 ways, the way I think about it, as I look back. There's 2 ways. One I call the pharmaceutical approach, where we use single nutrients, like nutrient supplements and things like that, or their analogs, where the long-term benefits are highly questionable. And incidentally, just this, maybe 2 months ago, there's a really substantial report now coming out summarizing these multiple mega-million-dollar studies that have been done on nutrient supplements, concluding, in fact, that vitamins A and C and E don't work. Really, they don't work, not in the long-term benefit. But in any case, that's the pharmaceutical approach, taking a single chemical coming out and claiming that's nutrition. Nutritional approach really involves the highly integrated effects of all the so-called nutrients or chemicals in food, as food. It's a natural sort of way. Now, let's look at a little bit of the background, because as I said, I go back some 4 or 5 decades, And I can tell you that as I look back, this particular chart here was key. It was a chart that was put together by Ken Carroll, the late K.K. Carroll at the University of Western Ontario, where he basically compared the breast cancer rates for different countries. Some others did this too, but Ken's work was particularly notable in this case. And what he showed is that there are big differences between breast cancer rates in different countries, number one. And number two, it seemed to show this really impressive relationship with dietary fat. And it was from this particular body of data that really gave rise to some policy and some education and some other statements about 20, 30 years ago that we should cut down on our fat intake. That plus the information on fat and heart disease as well. But in any case, this kind of plot here, one could put breast cancer on that y-axis, colon cancer, heart disease, and so forth and so on, and see that kind of relationship with dietary fat. That's why we got caught up in this idea of thinking about dietary fat. Okay, the second point to make about that previous slide is that there now have been dozens of studies, so-called migrant studies, when we know that when people move from one risk area, from a high-risk area to a low-risk area, vice versa, they get the disease of the country to which they move without changing their genes. Interesting. So it's an environmental, and would argue largely a dietary sort of phenomenon. But I sort of wonder a little bit why it is that these days we're emphasizing genetics so much as a cause of disease. I mean, I'll just say this, every single biological event that we experience starts out with a gene. But that does not mean the genes are sitting there and sort of doing their own thing. These genes have to get expressed. And that's where nutrition comes into play. And so, quite frankly, we've known in the field for a long time that not more than 2 to 3% of cancers, for example, that is really attributable to genes. It's nutrition. Okay. Largely from these migrant studies. My own work, formally at least, after I got out of graduate school, was getting involved in a big nationwide program of feeding malnourished and starving children in the Philippines with my senior mentor at the time, Butch Engel. It goes back to the 60s. Got things backwards here again anyhow, sorry. When we went to the Philippines, and because of my previous training, trying to grow cows better and regarding animal protein so highly, we were led to believe that if you're going to actually feed kids in the third world, one of the most important things is to make sure they got enough protein. And what they generally meant by that was making sure they got enough animal-based protein. Okay? So that's what I did when I first got involved in the Philippine study. But then I noted through sort of happenstance and, as it were, an observation, namely that higher protein intakes, quite frankly, were associated with higher rates of liver cancer in children. We had another project going trying to figure out what really caused liver cancer, by the way, and we thought it was related to a so-called mycotoxin or a mold toxin called aflatoxin, and that was the theory of the day. And in any case, what really turned out to be the case, and this was exactly the opposite what, in fact, I had been taught, the people who were getting liver cancer were the ones consuming, like us, the highest intake of animal protein, or animal-based diets, if you will. I didn't think too much in terms of protein per se, but eating like Westerners. It raised the question, the great American diet causing cancer? Really strange and pretty provocative. I told that to some of my senior colleagues at the time. They thought I was a bit nuts, and I shouldn't go there. But about that same time in the 1960s, there was some work came out of India with experimental animals, where basically animals fed either normal levels of protein, 20%, that's the normal level, or the lower level, 5%. And keep in mind, most of my remarks are going to concern this range of 5% to 20%. So animals fed 20% as opposed to animals given 5%. The ones given 20%, the normal level, they all, 100% got the liver tumors. They previously, both sets of animals had been exposed to the carcinogen, but they all got the tumors. The animals that got the much lower level did not. Really quite strange, but very significant. This then led to a long series of studies that was funded by the National Institutes of Health, by NIH, published in a number of different journals, also funded to some extent by the American Cancer Society and other places. I point this out because at this time, this work really was handsomely funded, quite frankly, by funding from our public till and from professional agencies, and did, of course, get published extensively. And you might wonder, how did that happen if I'm coming on this idea of protein? Well, in those days when we were doing this, I was focused on trying to understand what caused cancer. And so we were looking at this sort of model, if you will, studying all these mechanisms of cancer. So the question that we had was, did liver tumors really grow faster when rats are fed normal compared to low-protein diets? That was the question, because here the Indian workers have found this. And secondly, what we like to do in research, we like to say, oh, let's look and find the mechanism, as if there is the mechanism. And so, I mean, that's the way research today is done, in fact. We have to go in there and probe all these little details. So there's two main questions. And now I just want to summarize for you just 2 slides summarizing these extensive numbers of studies, just to illustrate a point. And this is where I'm getting a little worried, when you sort of get into this kind of thing. Namely, what we basically found was that we could turn on and turn off tumor growth simply by changing the level of protein intake within that 5 to 20% range. It was really quite remarkable, and I could show you many different ways of looking at that question that we pursued and got that result. It was very exciting in a sense, in some ways. To see something just like protein within that normal range that we actually consume ourselves, just turn on and turn off tumor growth. I could get into some of the details there on that particular slide, but I won't. I think you can see what I'm talking about. Over time, incidentally, in this case, it's early tumor formation, early cancer. Okay, so we worked with early cancers for some reasons, and without actually going to full-blown cancers. Finally, the ultimate study was done, at least in this particular case, where these are animals, for example, that were fed for their lifetime protein intake at different levels, 5%, 12%, 20%. Look in the top panel there. And if you look across to the right where it says tumor severity, you can see the animals fed the normal level, the 20%. They had a tumor index, if you will. That means numbers of tumors and the size of tumors and all that. 3,300 to some. The animals fed 5%, it's 248. In other words, huge difference. So we were answering the first question. This normal level of protein just turned on tumor growth. It's amazing. 12%, which is just above the level they actually need for growth. Even there, it was turning it on. But once you get below 10%, we looked at that, you didn't see really much any activity. Protein is required, by the way. It's obviously an essential nutrient. But what we were basically showing was when we went above the level that actually was needed, that's when the problem started. And quite frankly, most of us consume more protein than we need. Okay, here's the real kicker. The 5% animals, which my colleagues all thought would have been dead, with tumors, at the end of their life, weren't. They were all lifty, jumping around the cage and living. They were all thrifty, sleek coats, very much alive, and essentially no tumors. The animals fed this good level of protein were all dead. So here we were seeing, really, in the most robust, extensive kind of study that we could think of doing, showing that just normal levels of protein had this dramatic effect on causing this kind of tumor growth. And quite frankly, there's no other nutrient that can have this kind of effect at this particular level. Then in the bottom panel are some other additional sort of observations where we did things like to see if we could intervene. In other words, as tumors are growing up to a certain point in their life, and let's say a quarter of the animals are already having tumors, that with 20% and then switching to 5%, they get to 2013 at the end there compared to the 33. In other words, without getting into too much of the details, what we were basically showing here was that even when tumors are already present, we're not now talking about preventing too much. We're talking about tumors already growing robustly. They're there. And we changed the nutrient intake, the protein intake level, and we could switch off fairly late in the process. It's a really kind of interesting idea. So finally, I'm going to tell you what the protein is. I didn't talk a lot about it, certainly not in the grant applications that I was getting and so forth, but this protein was casein, cow's milk protein, 87% of cow's milk protein. And I've had quite a lot of experience with the agencies, both in this country and abroad, the United Nations, who look after deciding, what's a carcinogen, what's not. And there are certain criteria that these folks follow, criteria that determine when we decide a chemical is carcinogenic, if you will. The IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer. If I apply that evidence, these criteria that's used by everybody else to decide what's a carcinogen, I have to conclude there's no other way. And I've given this seminar to professional audiences in universities about 4 or 5 times now with this chart. And I don't get any questions, I don't get any comments. Everybody sort of sits there and kind of stunned. But quite frankly, I have to say that casein, which I'm going to argue is reflective of a larger sort of body of evidence having to do with animal proteins in general, is a carcinogen. It's the most significant carcinogen we consume. Forget about DDT and dioxin and things like that. We're talking about animal protein. And I just list here just a quick summary of why I think this is so profound. First off, the evidence is deep. That means to say, instead of finding the mechanism, every time we look for a mechanism, we found one. And that's a really provocative thought. I find that so exciting because, and I wish I had the time to share with you what I feel like goes on inside of a cell. I mean, it's a dynamic system. It's an amazing system. There's all this stuff sort of working together, millions of chemicals that somehow they just all feed in together and they converge to create the same effect. And that's what's happening when protein is fed. So it's real. This is not fake. So it's deep. It's multiple mechanisms. It's relevant because we're working in the range of 5 to 20%. We're not given, really high levels to make us sick or animals sick or anybody, us animals or other animals sick. We're talking about regular levels, so it's relevant. Breast, this effect works also for mammary tumors. That's breast cancer. I had a colleague at the University of Illinois who was working on this at the time, not going into quite so much detail as we did, but nonetheless getting similar results, showing that he could control mammary tumor development as well. Also, this effect could be used in cases where the tumor was started with either a chemical carcinogen or a virus. I mean, some viruses start cancer, like hepatitis B virus in the case of liver cancer. We could basically turn that on and turn it on off too, simply by changing protein intake. The specificity, that's where really things really kind of started heating up, because in this case, when we used soy or wheat, same level, 20%, it didn't do it. Kind of unique for casein. And of course, now I'm thinking, I better start talking about this a little more publicly and getting into trouble, of course, along the way. But quite frankly, I didn't want to stop just at the point of focusing on one nutrient, protein, because I have a problem with that. As I said in the beginning, I think nutrition is about the holistic, integrated effect of all kinds of stuff in food. It really is what it is. So I don't want to just focus on just this protein effect. Maybe when we're consuming animal protein, for example, we're consuming as food, maybe the other things in there don't necessarily go along with it. So we wanted to expand our investigation a little bit and ask whether or not it was consistent with other biological effects within that range. And for that, we went into the literature. We had some of our own information, our own data, went into the literature. And here's what animal proteins do. They increase blood cholesterol. That was first observed in 1909 and studied extensively in the 40s and 50s. And in humans, extensive human studies in the 70s and 80s, to the point that animal protein, in my view, is more hypercholesterolemic than a saturated fat. Certainly more than cholesterol itself. It's that significant, and there's lots of studies on that. Lactoalbumin is another protein in milk, for example. It increases atherosclerosis and other experimental conditions, really quite dramatic. It compromises vitamin D status and increases prostate cancer. Animal protein does. And now we know a lot about that. I think it was Dean already said something about this, as I recall. I forget it was Neil or Dean said something about the vitamin D thing. Well, the vitamin D story is now emerging. You probably heard we all should take vitamin D. It's not really true. You know, people are sort of getting caught in this idea of taking vitamin D when they're consuming the wrong diet, but that's not going to do them a lot of good, in my view. Now we know also animal proteins increase that. This is what Dr. Ornish, I think, pointed out, this insulin-like growth factor 1. It's sort of like the cholesterol of the cancer field. It turns on IGF-1, plant proteins decrease it, increases calcium bone loss. I mean, in other words, you start looking at the literature, you find this animal protein thing is really quite substantial. So then you ask another question. What about other nutrients other than animal protein? Maybe are there dietary patterns here? You know, getting away from this thing about single nutrients and get on into, you know, a broader view of the field, if you will. Maybe animal-based foods versus plant-based foods. That's one way to divide it up. I mean, I should suggest for your thinking there's another way too, and that's talking about whole natural foods, if you will, as opposed to breaking the foods up and making, you know, things like sugar and fat all by itself. But so this is one way, is just animal versus plant-based foods. And so we decided to do a comprehensive human study. It was fortuitous that, in fact, we had this opportunity in rural China, and I want to tell you a little bit about the rural China, this China study, because there, as we entered into that study, I came into that study with a background of having serious questions about animal protein and looking for dietary patterns. And the study came about because the Chinese government had established in the 70s that for about a dozen different cancers, these cancers were highly localized geographically around the country. Again, the National Institutes of Health, together with the Chinese government, funded this study. It was the first joint study between the United States and China at the time. And I just want to acknowledge some of my colleagues who obviously made all this possible for all of us to work together. The four of us were involved. Sir Richard Peto from the University of Oxford in England, brilliant biostatistician, I should add. Myself, Wenharn Pan was a student of ours, a PhD student of ours at Cornell, and Junshou Chen, who's really one of the most remarkable people I've ever met. He now tends to be, since I've known him, tends to be the Chinese representative of the United Nations, various panels and so forth. Chen's like a brother. That's why we look alike, by the way. In the China study, here were some really exciting data showing that, you know, when I said that cancers occurred in certain parts of the country and not in others, the range of rates, if you will, across the country for these different cancers are shown here for men and women. And you can see it's, what, 2 or 3 dozen-fold, maybe a couple hundred-fold. I mean, cancer was localized in some places, was right here, and over here it's not here. They had that kind of concentration. In this country, if we see a 2-fold concentration, or even less, it makes headlines. Here we're talking about big differences. That's ideal, incidentally, for doing a study. So, okay, let's go to China and organize and see what, in fact, they're doing. And we organized 65 counties, 130 villages, 6,500 adults and their families across the whole of China to do the study. Shown here in the first thing, wide range of rates, as I said. We also had an opportunity to look at a whole lot of other diseases as well as the cancers. Collected all kinds of information on diet, and lifestyle, and disease by collecting blood samples and urine samples and food samples and asking questions and so forth and so on, and then analyzing them. Before I get to that, let me just point out to you why the study in some ways was so unique. I go back to the original chart of Ken Carroll's, where you see fat intake and breast cancer in a nice straight line, really impressive. We all making assumptions as dietary fat, if you will. However, those impressions about dietary fat and breast cancer were largely drawn from studies that were done in the upper right quadrant. See where the United States is? We're up there. We're getting close to leading the pack in terms of breast cancer and a lot of these diseases. And so all of these human studies have been conducted, case control studies and prospective cohort studies and studies like this have been done on people living up in that region of the world there. Our study was the first that was actually going down near the bottom and looking at what the relationship really is. And this is important because if that line for the whole thing You know, we knew in the upper right-hand quadrant, as far as individual studies are concerned, that it fit that line, but we didn't know down here at the bottom. And people were in the research world saying, oh, maybe this is not true. Maybe this is just because we have more telephone poles in some places. I mean, all these silly things. So we just wanted to have a look from the dietary's perspective about China, and China was in the lower left-hand quadrant. Now here's just some summary information on what we found in China. We ended up looking at lots and lots of different things, as you'll see in a moment. But I just want to summarize here a couple of points. First off, in rural China, look at the energy intake. The calorie intake is higher. It's 10, 11% higher in rural China than is here per body weight. Well, part of that is attributable to the fact that the Chinese are more physically active. However, this will surprise you. The Chinese we're looking at here, these are the office worker type Chinese. They're the least active, and they're still consuming 10 to 11% more. I mean, they still go to work on their bicycles and things like that, so I think, but there's another effect here, and it has to do with the fact, I'm convinced of this, people who are consuming a low-fat, sort of plant-based diet, basically consume more energy and end up gaining less body weight. You heard Dr. Orney say that. And I think Dr. Bernard said the same thing, and Dr. McDougall, of course, and others have made this point many times. Eat more, weigh less kind of thing. You can see the body mass index, which is the body mass or weight, excess weight, is lower in China. Okay, the fat intake in China, as you can see, is much lower than here, 14% versus 36%. In rural China, dietary fiber is about 3 times higher. There's the key, is animal protein, and just using it as an index of the kind of diet. Our diet in the United States and other Western countries has 10 times the concentration of animal protein as does, or was, in fact, the case in rural China. That's changing, incidentally, in China, particularly in the city areas. They're starting to do what we do, and I don't know why they're doing that, but they're doing it. Blood cholesterol levels in rural China, their high is near our low. The average cholesterol level in rural China is about 127 milligrams per deciliter, really quite remarkable. But enough for that. We then, actually with many colleagues from different universities and elsewhere, looked at specific relationships that were of interest at the time. And basically, it seemed like every time we looked for a relationship and then asked this kind of question, does it point to this dietary pattern thing, does it point to an animal thing or a plant thing? Virtually every time we looked at it, it says it points to a plant-based diet. And this was really quite remarkable because keep in mind, in China, the amount of animal protein they were consuming is really quite low. It's only 1/10 of ours. But still within that range, what we could see, as soon as they start creeping up and getting little animal protein-based foods in their diet, these Western diseases started to occur. And we looked at this in many different ways. Really quite remarkable. So it went beyond the question of animal protein per se. The more significant question was just animal-based foods and or the lack of plant-based foods. Whole natural plant-based foods. So after doing a lot of these comparisons and interpreting a wide variety of these relationships, as I said, virtually all favor the nutrient composition of plant-based foods. And we sort of made that conclusion. We hesitate in science sometimes to make conclusions like this, but by this time, after having so much information and such a broad basis for the information, it led to that thing at the bottom. The richer the diets is and the kind and amount of nutrients provided by plant-based foods, the lower is the risk for these chronic degenerative diseases we see in the West. Now, I want to go back a little bit because it raises some other kinds of questions. Let's go back to the background slide I showed in the beginning of Ken Carroll that seemed to captivate so many of us for so long, showing a relationship between breast cancer and total fat. And let's look at that line a little closely. And just allow me to speculate a little bit here. If you take that line down, it crosses that x-axis at the bottom, where you can see there's no breast cancer when people are consuming, what is it, 30 grams or so a day of fat? That's about right. We need some fat, but it's pretty low. In other words, up to about that level of fat, we don't really see anything. It's kind of neat. I went back and actually took Ken Carroll had these data. I just simply put some lines on it, some regression lines. But it turns out if you look at, as he did, You look at the relationship between plant fats and cancers, breast cancer, you don't see anything. So it's something about it. It's not plant fats. But if you look at animal fats, now see where that line goes? Right through the origin. Very different. I mean, that's really pretty remarkable, I think. And that line, I mean, it couldn't be better. It sort of says even adding just a small amount of animal fat. If we sort of, I'm going to call animal fat, let's put single quotes around that. You know, just small amounts of animal fat sort of starts creating this problem. However, I'm going to call it animal-based foods. We made a mistake 20, 30 years ago in focusing on fat. It wasn't animal fat. In fact, we have evidence now to suggest that maybe the polyunsaturated fats of plants are more problematic in causing tumor growth than the animal fats. But, big but, this only occurs when total fat intake is high. So it raises questions about high-fat diets, quite frankly. So it's animal-based foods, not fat. Now I want to go back to another question, and this has to do with the Nurses' Health Study, and I'm sorry I have to pick on the Nurses' Health Study at Harvard. I know the investigators there quite well, have known them from the beginning, particularly Professor Willett, who has been heading this up. But Professor Willett got involved in this really marvelous study of some, 90,000, I think it's up to about 120,000 nurses these days, and you've heard of it, I think. How many have heard of the Nurses' Health Study? Okay, everybody's heard of the Nurses' Health Study. He got involved in this question asking back in 1984, right after we had finished putting together a policy statement from the National Academy of Sciences to reduce fat intake. He organized this study to look at the relationship between fat intake and breast cancer for this large group of nurses. And after 8 years, 4 years, 8 years, and then subsequently 12 years, what he found was as fat, if you look at the amount of fat intake that women are consuming over that range, he saw no relationship. That observation is nearly destroyed. It really caused a big problem. It's almost destroyed the diet and disease proposition to some considerable extent. Because all of a sudden now you're hearing, public's getting confused. If fat has nothing to do with breast cancer, what next? I mean, it's that kind of thing. I want to tell you what the answer to this is. Namely, look at the yellow thing here. I say it's all in the R, and you probably don't know what correlation coefficients are, regression coefficients. But basically, it turns out that in the original data of Ken Kell, that slide shown there, as fat intake goes up, animal protein intake goes up right along with it. You get about a 90% correlation. The highest you can have is 100%. 90% is really impressive. So on an international basis, about 90%. In contrast, in Western populations, where we're eating all the wrong stuff, it turns out these women, and I can say that's for probably all people in this country who follow this advice, as they decrease their fat intake, by using lean cuts of meat and skim milk and this and that, as they decrease their fat intake, quite frankly, their animal protein, it was going up, if anything. So, they're gaining on this hand in theory, losing big time on this hand. Under those circumstances, if you look at the experimental data, I don't have the chance to get into this, but if you look at this critically, that's a recipe for disaster. Because it's not the animal fat, it's animal-based foods, really is what this is all about. And it has to do with this correlation coefficient we know, and we have some very good data on what this is all about. Now, I just threw some other odds and ends in here just to catch your attention. I think this was mentioned by who? Dr. Bernard, I believe. And you know what? Oh, Dean Orney said this. No, he said this. He's got this study going right now. We already have this information on prostate cancer and skim milk. How many of you heard this how many of you read this in the Los Angeles Times? Or the New York Times? Or heard on TV? I mean, the Harvard group has done much of this work, and I do have to give them credit for this, and that includes Walt Willett, by the way. No, actually, it doesn't include Walt. It's another guy, Ed Giovannucci and June Chen, who's now at Berkeley. They have summarized recently of 14 case-controlled studies that have been done on dairy and prostate cancer of 14, 12 have shown a statistically significant relationship. The other two just aren't strong enough to see anything. And they conclude that of all the predictors of prostate cancer, the consumption of dairy is the best predictor of prostate cancer. And how many people have heard this? It's just not getting out there. Somebody's, I don't want to say cooking the data, but they're controlling things. Okay, now, I sort of finally come to this point of view of, I guess in a scientific sense, being a bit of a fool and start talking about these kinds of things publicly. And the information is getting out there, I think, to some extent about the protein thing. And lo and behold, in 2002, we had this report, this esteemed report that comes from the Food and Nutrition Board of the National Academy of Sciences, a group of people. I mean, this particular group of people are the ones who set national nutrition policy. They're the ones who set dietary guidelines, not dietary guidelines, but they're the ones that determine RDAs and things like this. I mean, they're very powerful. They're working behind the scenes, usually unbeknownst to the American public, and setting standards. And the references they set, and they review them every 5 years or so, the references they set are used to establish what the school lunch program looks like. They're the references set for hospital food. You know how great that is. It's the references set for the WIC program, Women, Infants, and Children's program. I mean, this is what it's all about. Well, they just came out just last year with this report, and this is on the front page of their executive summary and their news summaries. The report recommends that to meet the body's daily nutritional needs while minimizing risk for chronic disease, adults should consume 10 to 35% from protein. Wow. That's incredible. And furthermore, the added sugars, you know, and they're specific. They're making this, that candy, soft drinks, fruit drinks, pastries, and other sweets should comprise no more than 25% of total calories consumed. It's just a coincidence, by the way, that M&M Mars helped to fund this study. And the Coca-Cola industry. This is National Academy of Science. This is the body that's supposed to be making the sort of prominent statement. And I served on a number of those expert panels myself, and I don't remember when we were doing that we had that kind of support. We were using public money. Now the industry is coming in there, sort of getting some money behind us. And yeah, I know it doesn't have any effect on all of this, but to say that 35% protein is okay, it's associated with it minimizing, you know, chronic disease risk, I think it's obscene. I don't know how else to say it. The 25% added sugars, by the way, is really interesting. They set 25% at the same time the WHO was coming up with a report, about the same time, where they're making similar kinds of determinations. They said the maximum should be 10%. And the chairman is a friend of mine, the chairman of that panel, Phil James. So they said 10%. And here in the West, this came out just before the WHO report did, they said 25%. So I'm wondering, how can a group of scientists, two groups of scientists come up with these very different figures? 25%, you can go up to 20, or 10%? Well, it turns out, as they say, I don't know, maybe the M&M Mars did have something to do with it. The sugar industry gets on their high horse and basically are going and threatening the WHO report and the panel and said, get that thing, that 10% up to 25%. If you don't, we're going to go see Tommy Thompson. We got some friends in the White House. We're going to go to Congress, and we're going to ask the United States to withdraw funds from the United Nations. That's what happened. And I don't know how many of you really know that, but they really did use strong-arm tactics to try to get the United Nations panel to change their 10% level for added sugars up to 25%, like the United States did. I mean, we behaved. We did the right thing. We got up to 25%, you see. I'll come back to the protein thing just for a minute. I just want to show you how important this really is. I've talked about the 5 to 20%. And incidentally, let me say this, that the experimental animal work that I did, or we did, experimental animals, or like us animals, the amount of protein we require is the same as they do, and it's all sort of coincidence, about the same. If you look at the range of intake of protein for us animals, us humans, we range between 11 and 22%. That is, 5% of us are a little lower than 11%, 5% of us, the weightlifters and stuff, some of the weightlifters up 22%. The amount that we've known for 50 years how much protein we only need 10%. Our average intake is 17%. We're somewhere between 11 and 22. And nobody hardly goes above 22. Now this esteemed body is coming along and telling us we can go up to 35. Welcome Atkins. I could go on and on about this, but I won't. Especially since the chairman of the Food and Nutrition Board is now the director of the division of which I'm in at Cornell University. Okay, so let me make a couple concluding remarks here. I think it's time, we've got to take this idea and bring it to a new level of discussion. It's got to have certain characteristics. We can't just sit around and talk to each other. We've got to somehow invade the medical establishment. I know what it's all about. And really open this up for the public, because I think the public's really interested in this. I disagree with many of my colleagues who say the public's not interested. I'm going to say this. Whereas major disease rates have remained high in recent years, whereas the cost of medical care is the highest in the world, a couple of givens, whereas contemporary food production is costly and environmentally unsound, isn't it possible that we should start taking nutrition seriously? And if it's properly investigated, interpreted, and practiced, it could become the premier biological science of the future? This is where it's at. It's not there now. It has something to do with who's controlling the information. And this is something the public really doesn't understand. What goes on behind the scenes in the development of policy, reference standards, it's basically who's controlling the agenda. That's what it's about. And it's something that's terribly misunderstood by the public. Almost no one really knows about this unless you've been in the boardrooms and sort of watched this kind of thing. And incidentally, I don't want to treat this superficially. It's not about industry funding the research. The industry probably funds about 5 to 10% of the research in this field in this country. It's money coming from the government, basically. It's also not about industry paying off people. It's also not about the vast majority of scientists being, dishonest and stuff like that. It's not true. The vast majority of scientists are hardworking, diligent, devoted people to their work. They're working in kind of narrow little areas. So, we do have a class of very hardworking people. I don't want to disparage them. We have a few people sort of behave like something else. They just sort of there are the transition. So in any case, I don't want to get into this too much, but what I do want to say is that we need to take this information, elevate it to a level of professionalism, widely discussed, and get it out there and start thinking about it in that sort of way. And so I've been asking myself, at least, where do we go with all this? How does this happen? How do we expand this story beyond us who have been involved in this to some extent? As I say, it's about who controls the information, who funds it, who makes policy, who dispenses it. Who's making policy is the one. That's really, you heard, who was it? Yeah, Neil Bernard talk about what the American Cancer Society wants to run some bulls down to Peach Street in Atlanta these days, and every other street in the United States. And I would really urge you to follow Neil's advice on that. Contact them. We need to have transparency, discourse, and open education. Right now, we can't have that because we don't have the resources. We're sort of tied into sort of doing little bits of studies here and there and stuff. I really am interested in somehow going to establish, let's say, at a major institution that has some recognition, to establish a place where we can have lots of transparency, lots of discourse, lots of open education. And the only way we can do that is to have the funding that lasts forever. It's the only way. We can't sort of just go from 2 years, 3 years, go back into the till all the time, because that's how the information is controlled. I know it so well. The control is really who has the funding to give out to do what is being done. Those of us in this kind of field here, we don't have any money. We can't. Who's going to fund vegetarian research, for crying out loud? It's really difficult. And so we need to sort of figure out some way to get this going. And quite frankly, we have, in fact, given consideration to this at Cornell. We are and have been for many years ranked as the top institution, the #1 institution in the country, both in terms of quality and quantity. And I think Cornell would be a good place to sort of hang our hat in doing this kind of thing as long as we have the resources. We thought this through fairly carefully. As to what we want to do, we have an internal advisory group, we have an external advisory group, really a blue-ribbon panel, I should say. And so we're on track of trying to do this. And I'm just going to conclude to tell you that, whether we do it or whether someone else does it, this is what we need to do. We've got to raise the consciousness of this country to the level of really understanding this. And two of my colleagues are here, actually, who are sort of running the shop for us, Dr. Banu Parpia and David Cushell. Where are you? Way back, and way in the back there. I think Jeff invited me to. Jeff invited me to go ahead and make these remarks. I hope that you don't think it's self-serving. I'm too old for that anyhow, and we'll go on and do something else. But I want just simply in terms of the idea. I want the public to get more involved in this. I want all kinds of scientists and other sorts of people to get involved in this kind of symposia and workshops and study period, and to have the money to do it. And so there is a brochure in your packet, I think, that's called PLN, Program for Lifetime Nutrition. I'll leave that thought with you and simply say, we have arrived with this information, and if you don't believe me, wait till you hear Dr. Esselstyn and Dr. Furman and Dr. McDougall and Dr. Lyle, who's got this new book out telling us why we can't get on with these, Dr. Lyle and Dr. Goldhammer. I mean, these are the people out there really doing things. And we're ready to go. We just need to involve the public more in this sort of thing and to get that kind of support. Thank you. Okay.
Yes, my question is, I understand that they're revising the dietary guidelines or talking about it, that Dr. Willett is promoting a Harvard-based revision, and I was wondering if you're involved in that and any comments you have on that process.
Not directly just now. I was involved a little bit in the beginning with the Harvard Mediterranean diet thing. But that's certainly, it's of interest, and, but it doesn't go very far. I have some concerns about the Mediterranean diet putting so much focus on olive oil, sort of being the solution for our difficulties, and I don't believe that, because there's another way of looking at information. Really has to do with the fact that the people in the Mediterranean countries who are using relatively high levels of olive oil and actually experiencing somewhat reduced rates of these diseases, they also are consuming diets very high in plant-based foods. And in fact, if you compare those rates in southern Mediterranean countries with what we see in rural China, their rates are pretty high. And so you might ask, why are the rates so high? Is it because they're eating the olive oil? I have this, I don't know, I seem to look at things a little bit differently, I guess. But no, on the dietary guidelines thing, I've been in a number of those panels, those kind of panels, and the new one has just been named, and I'm obviously not on that one, but I'm really concerned that the way the system operates, the people who end up getting on these panels are the people who are almost, willing to be the good guys, and play the game and stay with the status quo. And so a lot of it has to do with who's choosing these members. And those people are oftentimes the ones who sometimes have very close association with the industry. I can understand, I have to tell you, and I've said this for years, I don't like to be too hard-nosed about the corporate world in this case, because the corporate world is doing what they're intended to do. And we all know what they want to obviously make a profit. They stretch things, of course, they're trying to but I don't want to go there in a sense, because the question is much larger than that. The question is basically getting information out and getting it discussed and including their participation. But basically going to the American public and telling the American public, this, getting to understand information and creating a different kind of demand structure for these products.
I
Yes.
have two questions. One is, are you including fish protein in the animal-based diet? And could you just address briefly the biochemical pathway of the difference between the animal protein and the plant-based protein, why you're having that kind of
Right.
result?
First off, fish protein, at least going back incidentally to Professor Carroll's work some years ago, he compared a bunch of animal proteins with a bunch of plant proteins and their ability to elevate cholesterol. And fish protein behaved rather similarly to other animal proteins. And there was no overlap between these two groups of proteins. So fish protein is rather like animal protein in that sense. I mean, there's other questions that come up here, and there's certain kinds of fish we know have these interesting fatty acids, omega-3s and things like that. Cold water fish in particular, they seem to have maybe some beneficial effect at times, especially on cholesterol levels. And so it's possible that there is an exception to this animal-plant dichotomy. I've often suggested that maybe cold water fish and, is one of the kinds of foods that might fit in that category. As far as the so-called mechanism of the protein effect is concerned, part of it is due to the fact that the animal proteins have a profile of amino acids that's rather similar to us animals. And so we consume those animals for ourselves. All those amino acids that are there in the right ratio, and we use it more efficiently and faster, and we grow faster, and we do everything else that we're supposed to do. Plant proteins usually are deficient in one or two of those, so they don't get used as rapidly. That's one issue. The second issue is that going to the food, the plant proteins obviously are embedded in many, many other things like dietary fiber and antioxidants and all these other wonderful things that sort of create for that food a very different sort of effect from the animal foods. So that in a sense is what it's about, yeah.
It seems like you focused on cancer, though. Can you comment specifically on cancer and not heart disease?
Right. Well, the cancer, there's one study that I found kind of intriguing, was published in 1994. I think the author was Hildebrand, I believe was the first author. This study came out of a expert panel working for the General Accounting Office, trying to decide at that time, is it possible we could go back and look at some of the data in these alternative clinics, collect some information to see if in fact what's being done in those places might have led to, let's say, Russian cancer. And one clinic that was doing that was the Gerson Clinic in Tijuana, I guess, which obviously in the established medical circles had no name whatsoever. That panel got together, decided, set up some really rigorous criteria. Then they went off, and one of the members of the panel collected data from the Gerson Clinic on melanoma patients. And the Gerson people were actually using mostly a plant-based diet. They were doing a couple of other things too, but they were mostly using a plant-based diet. And what they found when they looked at those data in a really rigorous sense, using these really good criteria, melanoma could be really held in check, to a large extent, even people with advanced melanoma, by switching to a plant-based diet. That's published. And I think there's other evidence for other kinds of cancers too. I think the evidence with Dr. Ornish is talking about prostate cancer, for example. So any time in life, whatever condition, it seems to me that this kind of works.
We speak about the fact that doctors get little training in nutrition, and I don't really know what the answer to this question is, but anytime I hear a nutritionist or a dietitian speak, they talk about our need to get ample high-quality protein and the need to drink milk to get calcium and all kinds of things that those of us in this room know are very dangerous to our health. And I don't know, what approach do you think could be taken to educating nutritionists and dietitians about this research that has gone on?
Well, dietitians obviously get a lot of training in nutrition. I'm not sure it's exactly focused the right way. I'm also a little concerned with the American Dietetic Association itself. They take support from the dairy industry, and advertising. Last time I looked, at least, that's the way it was. The dairy influence in this country is penetrating, old, and very substantial. And somehow I think we have to deal with this question, you know, how do we get the information out there again? I say the same thing. I don't know, the dietitians, they do get a lot of training. And I find it kind of strange that in hospitals, for example, hospital settings, the doctor has the last say about what the diet should be oftentimes, so I'm told. When they only have, gosh, 1/10, you know, the training that the dietitian does in the area of nutrition.
Colin, I have a sort of a three-part question for you, and I'd like to get your response to this question. I'd like to get Doug Lyle's response to this question, and I'd like to have John McDougall's response to this question. And that is that we've been hearing a lot about, in recent years, about the experiments that are going on showing that people, or rather, excuse me, that animals can be shown to live longer if they are undernutrition, but rather than malnutrition. And I think that Dean Ornish touched on it yesterday, said there was an article in the New York Times yesterday about that. I have not seen that. But I think that there needs to be some clarification about those studies, and I think that it would be, I think, rather interesting to have your views on these studies. Doug, I think I'd like to have you chime in on that. And John, if you wouldn't mind as well, where is he? If please, as well. So, Colin, could you lead off?
Yeah, the question I think that, as you're really asking, of course, as you know, is it the amount of food that matters, or is it the kind of food? I mean, that's the way it sort of works out, I think. And it goes back to some old studies in the 30s and 20s, actually by a man by the name of Clive McKay, and I was his last student, by the way. I took my master's back in many years ago now. What basically showed, these are experimental animals, you hold their calorie intake down to about 60-70% of what they otherwise could consume, and they live much longer. And then there's this man, Dr. Walford, a gentleman I do not know, who's done much of the similar kind of work as well, and some others. And so it's led to this idea that cutting calories has great benefits. We know that. I think that's true. It's pretty well established. The problem is, I think it's the amount of calories that we need to cut is hard to sustain. I think Dean said this yesterday. It's very hard to sustain. Getting 20-30% reduction, staying there, and doing it for a long period of time is virtually impossible for almost everyone. What I find really interesting is that, especially in these experimental animal studies, the 5% animals that lived and thrifty and all that, they actually ate 3 to 5% more calories. In other words, so it really tended to show me, at least, it's not about calories. It's about the kind of food. I'm answering, probably was a rhetorical question. Anyhow, Doug.
I think that these studies confound some variables, and that is that if the issue is whether or not a rat eating to satiation is effectively going to cause its premature death by developing disease. And so what we find is that when rats eat commercial rat chow that they use in scientific studies to satiation, what they wind up are things like heart attack, strokes, congestive heart failure, diabetes, cancer, things like that. And yet when they have these same rats eat less than what they would like to eat, they wind up reducing those disease processes. And of course, then the implication is that if people would just push themselves away from the table and eat fewer calories, they could eat just the same things that they're eating now, but they would reduce the disease. I think that's true. But it's also completely impractical, because you're designed by nature to eat to satiation. Now, if those same rats were not to be eating commercial rat chow, but as Colin is suggesting, if they were to eat the food that they were designed to eat, they would reach satiation, but they would not get these disease processes. And the same is true for human beings. And so these studies have confounded these variables and wound up with, I think, a highly misleading result. There is more to it than this, and we could go into this at another time, but that is a big problem with the implications coming from these studies as I see it. I'd love to hear what John knows everything, so.
Thanks, Doug. Doug and I work together, you can tell. This is a species survival mechanism, this effect you're looking at. In other words, when a species does not have enough food for the species to survive, it prolongs its life and its reproductive years. It's a natural thing. It's what's supposed to happen. The problem, as alluded to, is how do you cut down on your calorie intake without starving? A man named Listner back in the early 1980s really showed how this is done so well. Listner took people and he fed them a blinded set of meals. What he did is he made up the meals, and he made 4 different kinds of meals. And what he did is in each meal plan, he changed the fat content. So the muffins looked the same, the breads looked the same, the beans looked the same, everything looked the same. People couldn't tell any difference. All he did was change the amount of fat by adding different amounts of oil to the food. So totally blinded to the subjects. And he said, eat as much as you want to the subjects. Well, depending upon the fat intake, determined how many calories. Those who ate a 45% fat diet ate 2,800 calories. Those who ate a 35% fat diet, again, they didn't know, just naturally ate a 2,600 calorie diet. When you dropped it down to around 15% of the calories as fat in the diet, they were naturally eating 2,200 calories. So you can eat a low-calorie diet without suffering at all, but you have to understand the basics of food. It's really easy to do. Starving won't do it. I couldn't do it. I don't know if any of you could do it, but I can certainly change the composition of my food to easily cut the calories down. And while I'm doing that, I'm also improving all the other qualities that we've been talking about that result in less disease and greater longevity. The intention is to live long and healthy. You just got to know the right set of rules, as we all know here. Thank you.
Dr. Campbell, you made reference to vitamin D, and I know we hear a lot in the news about you need vitamin D, especially if you're at northern climates. Is that just not true if you're vegan? Could you address that, please?
Actually, I had a slide on that. I won't go to be too hard to find this computer right now, but the vitamin D story is really interesting. Just to back up just for a second, we can get all the D we need by getting adequate sunshine. And the D that we actually form, which incidentally, since we can form it, it's not a vitamin. Vitamin D is not a vitamin. It's a hormone, as you probably know. In any case, we form as much as we need. It gets us stored in the liver and a few other places in the body, but mostly the liver. And when it gets converted into the 25-hydroxy. It's called 25-hydroxy as hydroxy group. They just store there. And then it travels to the kidney. And it's converted to a second metabolite called 1,25-dihydroxy in the kidney. The stuff that's in the kidney, that's the critical level. And the amount, and it's very potent, that second metabolite, that vitamin D metabolite. And the body has this unique capability of monitoring and metering out exactly how much is needed from time to time. And what controls how much is there? One of the chief factors that controls how much is there is animal protein and calcium. Animal protein inhibits that. And quite frankly, the 1,25-dihydroxy, that metabolite, helps to repress cancer growth. It helps do lots of good things. But it's all about the body metering how much there should be there. Now all of a sudden you got people coming along saying, take vitamin D in food. First, it ignores the proposition. It tends to ignore the proposition of getting adequate sunshine. Secondly, what we're doing with that extra vitamin D is trying to fill up stores that may already be full, that in turn has nothing to do with the 1,25-dihydroxy. In fact, if anything, it might repress the formation of it. So there's good biochemical reasons to argue that vitamin D supplementation, although there is some evidence that it's helpful, but I think it's mostly helpful in people who aren't getting any sunshine, quite frankly, that story is going to play out and be exaggerated. And while we're ignoring, the total dietary context, it's a beautiful system. It's a beautiful system illustrating how nature can really work its wonders. If we just back off and let nature do it, in the right way, eat the right food.
Thank you very much, Colin Campbell.
Thank you.